pregnant girl was dragged through mud until a stranger paid one to save her. The town had no name worth remembering. It sat low and crooked against the flatland like something the desert had tried to swallow and then spit back out. The buildings leaned into each other, gray and sun-bleached, held together by rust and stubbornness. Dust moved through the streets like a living thing, curling around boots and wagon wheels, settling into every crack and corner. There was no wind that day, just heat, just silence. And then the shouting started. She came stumbling through the center of town, hands bound behind her back with frayed rope. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, caked in dirt and streaked with something darker. Her belly swelled beneath the fabric, round and heavy, and her feet dragged through the mud left behind by last night's rain. Two men walked behind her, one holding the rope like she was livestock. The other laughed. It was a cruel sound, sharp and empty, and it carried across the street like the crack of a whip. People stopped what they were doing. A woman at the general store pulled her children inside. A rancher leaning against a hitching post turned his head and spat into the dust. No one moved to help. No one even looked her in the eye. The girl's face was pale, her hair tangled and hanging over her shoulders. She did not cry. She did not beg. She only walked, her legs shaking beneath her, her breathing shallow and uneven. The man with the rope yanked her hard, and she fell forward into the mud. Her knees hit first, then her hands. The rope bit into her wrists. She did not make a sound. "Ain't nobody want her," the man said loudly, looking around at the gathered crowd. He was thick-shouldered and red-faced, with a voice that scraped like boots on gravel. "Ain't nobody gonna take her in. She's a shame to this town. A disgrace." The other man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "We oughta leave her out past the canyon. Let the coyotes have her." A few people laughed. Not loud, just enough to show they agreed. The girl stayed on her knees in the mud, her head lowered, her breath coming in short gasps. Her hands trembled. The rope around her wrists was tied too tight. Blood had begun to seep through where it rubbed against her skin. And still no one moved. The stranger had been sitting outside the saloon for most of the morning. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and his coat was dusty from the trail. His horse stood beside him, a dappled gray with tired eyes. He had not come into town looking for trouble. He had come for water and rest. Maybe a hot meal if the place had one. But when the shouting started, he lifted his head. He watched the girl fall. He watched the men laugh. He watched the townspeople turn away. He stood slowly, his boots scraping against the wooden boards of the saloon porch. His hand did not go to his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward, steady and quiet, like a man who had made up his mind about something and was too tired to argue. The man holding the rope looked up as the stranger approached. His grin faded. "This ain't your business, cowboy." The stranger stopped a few feet away. He was tall, lean, with a face that had seen too many miles and too many winters. His eyes were gray, the color of smoke or old steel. He looked at the girl, still kneeling in the mud, and then back at the man. "How much?" he asked. The man blinked. "What? How much for her?" The second man laughed again, but it sounded nervous this time. "She ain't for sale, mister. She's trash. We're just getting rid of her." The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a single silver dollar. He held it up between two fingers, letting the sunlight catch it. The coin gleamed, bright and clean against the dirt and grime of the street. $1, he said. "That's what I'm offering." The crowd had gone quiet now. Even the children had stopped whispering. The man with the rope stared at the coin, then at the stranger, then back at the coin. His jaw worked, but no words came out. "You serious?" he finally said. "Dead serious." The man looked at his partner. Then he looked at the girl. Then he shrugged. "Fine. Take her. She's yours." He tossed the rope forward, and the stranger caught it. The man with the yellowed teeth shook his head and muttered something under his breath, but they both turned and walked away, boots squelching in the mud. The crowd began to scatter. Doors closed. Conversations resumed. Within moments, it was as if nothing had happened at all. The stranger stood there, holding the rope. The girl had not moved. She was still on her knees, head bowed, shoulders trembling. He crouched down in front of her, slow and careful, like approaching a frightened animal. He pulled a knife from his belt, and she flinched. But he only cut the rope. The moment her hands were free, she brought them to her chest and rubbed at her wrists. Her skin was raw, marked with deep red lines. She did not look at him. She did not speak. He stood and offered his hand. She stared at it for a long moment. Her eyes were dark, wide, and hollow. They carried the kind of emptiness that came from being used up and thrown away. But slowly, shakily, she reached out and took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. She swayed, unsteady, and he steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. She was young, maybe 19, maybe less. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked, her dress hanging loose, except where her belly pressed against it. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Good." He led her toward his horse. The animal shifted, but did not spook. He untied the reins and turned back to her. "You got a name?" She hesitated. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Elsie." He nodded once. "All right, Elsie. You're coming with me." He did not tell her where they were going. He did not ask her story. He simply helped her up onto the saddle, mounted behind her, and turned the horse toward the edge of town. No one called after them. No one waved. The dying town sat silent in the heat, and they rode away from it without looking back. As the buildings grew smaller behind them and the open desert stretched out ahead, Elsie finally spoke again. "Why did you do that?" The stranger did not answer right away. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his hands steady on the reins. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, because no one else would. And that was all he said. The sun climbed higher. The desert shimmered in the distance. And two strangers rode together into a future neither of them could see, bound not by words, but by a single silver dollar and the weight of a choice that could not be undone. The desert stretched out before them like an ocean made of dust and stone. The sky hung low and colorless, pressed down by heat that shimmered in waves across the flatland. There were no trees, no buildings, just the endless roll of earth and sky, and the slow rhythm of hoofbeats breaking the silence. Elsie sat in front of him on the saddle, her body stiff and upright. She had not said a word since they left the town. She did not ask where they were going. She did not thank him. She only stared ahead, her hands resting lightly on the saddle horn, her breathing shallow and careful. The stranger could feel the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like something fragile that might break if touched too hard. He did not try to speak to her. He knew better than that. Words were cheap in the West. They floated away on the wind like smoke, and most of them meant nothing. Silence, though silence had weight. It could say more than 100 speeches. So he let the quiet settle between them, and he kept his eyes on the trail. They rode through the morning and into the afternoon. The sun climbed higher, burning white and merciless, and the sweat soaked through his shirt and hers. The horse plodded forward with tired, steady steps, its head low, ears flicking at flies. Once, Elsie swayed in the saddle, and the stranger reached out to steady her. She flinched at his touch, and he pulled his hand back. "Sorry," he said quietly. She did not respond, but after a moment, she straightened herself and sat still again. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the stranger could see the exhaustion written across her. Her head drooped forward. Her hands trembled. She was holding on, but barely. He scanned the land ahead and spotted a cluster of rocks rising up from the flat earth like bones pushing through skin. It would provide some shelter from the wind. Enough for a night. He guided the horse toward the rocks and brought it to a stop. Elsie did not move. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. This time, she did not flinch. She let him take her by the waist and lower her to the ground. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the earth, and he caught her before she fell. "Easy," he said. "You're all right." She leaned against him for just a second, her weight heavy and helpless, and then she pushed herself upright. She took 2 shaky steps away and sat down hard on a flat rock. Her eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell too fast. The stranger unsaddled the horse and let it wander toward a patch of dry brush. He pulled out his bedroll, a canteen, and a small leather pouch of dried meat. Then he gathered what little wood he could find, brittle twigs, a few pieces of broken branches, and built a small fire as the light began to fade. The flames came slow at first, flickering and weak, but he coaxed them into life with patient hands. The warmth spread outward, pushing back the chill that always came with the desert night. Elsie opened her eyes and watched him. She did not speak. She just watched. He poured water from the canteen into a tin cup and handed it to her. She stared at it for a long moment, as if she did not trust it. Then she took it and drank. Her hands shook so badly that water spilled down her chin, but she did not stop until the cup was empty. He offered her a piece of the dried meat. She shook her head. "You need to eat," he said. "I'm not hungry." Her voice was quiet, hoarse, like she had not used it in days. He did not argue. He just set the meat down beside her on the rock and sat on the other side of the fire. The flames crackled softly between them. The night pressed in around the small circle of light, vast and empty and cold. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The stranger leaned back against a rock and tilted his hat down over his eyes. He was used to silence. He had spent most of his life in it. Out here, in the wild open places where no law reached and no names mattered, a man learned to live with his own thoughts. Or he learned to stop thinking altogether. Elsie sat with her arms wrapped around her belly, her head bowed. The firelight flickered across her face, carving shadows under her eyes and along her cheekbones. She looked like a ghost, like something that had already passed out of the world and was only lingering out of habit. But then she spoke. "Why are you doing this?" The stranger did not lift his hat. He did not move. "Doing what?" "Helping me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you needed help. You don't even know me." "Don't need to." She looked at him, her eyes dark and searching. "People don't just help. Not for nothing." He tilted his hat back and met her gaze. His face was hard, weathered, but there was something steady in his eyes. Something that did not lie. "I'm not asking anything from you, Elsie. You can leave in the morning if you want. I won't stop you." She stared at him for a long time. Then she looked away, back into the fire. "I got nowhere to go." "Then you'll stay." "Why?" "Because nowhere's better than back there." She did not argue. She just nodded, slow and small, and pulled her knees up to her chest. The fire crackled. The night deepened, and the silence returned, softer this time, like something they could both carry without it breaking them. The stranger stretched out on his bedroll and closed his eyes. He did not sleep right away. He listened to the sound of her breathing, uneven and shallow, and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere far off in the dark. He thought about the town they had left behind. He thought about the rope around her wrists and the way no one had lifted a hand. He thought about the silver dollar in his pocket, now gone, and what it had bought. Not her freedom. That was not something you could buy. But maybe a chance. Maybe that was enough. When he woke in the middle of the night, the fire had burned down to embers. Elsie was still sitting on the rock, her head resting on her knees, her eyes closed. He could see her shivering in the cold. Without a word, he stood and draped his coat over her shoulders. She stirred but did not wake. She pulled the coat tighter around herself and settled back into sleep. The stranger sat down by the embers and fed them a few more twigs. The flames returned, small and fragile, but alive. He watched them dance in the darkness, and he thought about trust. How it was built not with promises, but with small things. A cup of water. A fire in the night. A coat when the cold came. He did not know if she would stay. He did not know if she would ever speak more than a few words. But for now she was here. And that was enough. The stars turned overhead, slow and silent, and the desert held them both in its vast, uncaring hands. Two strangers on a road to somewhere, or maybe nowhere. It did not matter yet. What mattered was the fire, and the quiet, and the slow, fragile beginning of something neither of them had asked for, but both of them needed. By morning, she would wake and find him already up, tending the horse and packing the saddle. She would stand and hand him back his coat without a word. He would take it and nod. And they would ride again, into the heat and the dust and the unknown. But tonight, in the stillness between darkness and dawn, there was only the fire, and the silence, and the slow, careful building of trust. The town appeared on the horizon like a promise. Small and neat, with painted storefronts and a white church steeple rising above the rooftops. Smoke curled from chimneys. Laundry hung on lines between buildings. It looked like the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where Sunday dinners lasted until dark, where a stranger might find a warm meal and a bed if he asked politely. But the stranger had been in enough towns to know that paint and church bells did not always mean kindness. They rode in slowly, the horses' hooves clopping softly against the hard-packed dirt of the main street. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the boardwalks. A few people were out, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a woman carrying a basket of vegetables, two boys chasing each other around a wagon. One by one, they stopped what they were doing and stared. Elsie felt their eyes before she saw them. She had learned to sense judgment the way animals sense storms. It came as a prickle on the back of her neck, a tightness in her chest. She kept her head down, her hands folded over her swollen belly, trying to make herself small. But there was no hiding what she was. The curve of her stomach told the story before she could open her mouth. The stranger guided the horse toward the general store. He dismounted and tied the reins to the hitching post, then reached up to help Elsie down. She slid from the saddle carefully, her movements slow and awkward. Her feet touched the ground, and she steadied herself against the horse's flank. "Wait here," the stranger said quietly. She nodded. He climbed the steps to the store and pushed open the door. A bell jingled above his head. Inside, the air smelled of flour and tobacco and lamp oil. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, and sacks of grain. Behind the counter stood a man with a thick mustache and suspenders, his arms crossed over his chest. "Help you?" the man asked. His tone was flat, unwelcoming. "Need some supplies," the stranger said. "Flour, coffee, whatever dried meat you got, and a blanket if you can spare one." The shopkeeper's eyes flicked toward the window, where Elsie stood beside the horse. He looked back at the stranger, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "That your wife?" The stranger did not answer right away. He met the man's gaze, steady and calm. "That's my business. Looks like trouble to me. I didn't ask what it looks like to you." The shopkeeper's jaw tightened. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Then the shopkeeper turned and began pulling items from the shelves, slamming them down on the counter with more force than necessary. He wrapped them in brown paper and tied the bundle with twine. "That'll be $3. The stranger paid without argument and took the supplies. He stepped back outside into the fading light. Elsie had not moved. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes on the ground. A small crowd had begun to gather across the street, women in bonnets and aprons, men in work clothes, all of them watching. The stranger loaded the supplies onto the horse and turned to Elsie. "Come on." They walked together down the street, leading the horse behind them. The whispers started almost immediately, low and hissing, like wind through dry grass. Elsie did not need to hear the words to know what they were saying. She had heard it all before. Shame, sin, disgrace. The words followed her like shadows, clinging to her no matter how far she walked. They passed the church, and a woman standing on the steps turned her back. They passed the saloon, and a rancher leaning against the door spat into the dirt. They passed a group of children playing in the street, and a mother hurried them inside, slamming the door behind her. Elsie's throat tightened. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She had cried enough. She had begged enough. She was done with both. The stranger kept walking, his face unreadable, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. He did not look at the people staring. He did not respond to the whispers. He simply walked, steady and unhurried, as if the weight of their judgment meant nothing to him. They reached the far edge of town, where the buildings thinned out and gave way to open land. There, set back from the road, stood an old barn. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the wood was gray and weathered, but it was shelter. The stranger pushed open the wide door, and they stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and dust and old leather. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, cutting the darkness into thin golden slices. A few bales of straw were stacked in one corner. A rusted plow sat in another. It was not much, but it was better than sleeping under the stars. The stranger unsaddled the horse and led it to a stall at the back. He spread out his bedroll on the straw and gestured for Elsie to sit. She lowered herself down slowly, her hand pressed to her belly. The baby kicked, hard and insistent, and she winced. The stranger knelt and opened the bundle of supplies. He handed her a piece of dried meat and a canteen of water. Eat. She took the food, but did not eat right away. She just held it in her hands, staring at it like she had forgotten what to do with it. They always stare, she said quietly. The stranger looked at her. Let them. It doesn't bother you? No. Why not? He was silent for a moment. Then he said, because their staring don't change anything. You're still here. You're still breathing. That's what matters. She looked down at the food in her hands. Her voice was barely a whisper. They think I'm a whore. They don't know you. They don't need to. They see this. She touched her belly. And they know. They think they know, he said. But they don't. She lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, he saw the weight of everything she had been carrying. Not just the baby, not just the shame, but the loneliness, the fear, the certainty that she would always be judged, always be cast out, no matter where she went or what she did. I didn't want this, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't choose this. The stranger did not move. He did not reach for her. He just listened. He was a rancher, she continued, the words tumbling out now like water from a cracked dam. I worked in his house, cleaned, cooked. His wife was kind to me. She treated me like I mattered. And he, her voice cracked. He came to my room one night. I told him no. I told him to leave. But he didn't. The barn was silent except for the sound of her breathing, ragged and uneven. When his wife found out I was carrying, she threw me out. Called me a liar. Said I tempted him. The whole town believed her. They always believed the man. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So they dragged me through the streets. Like I was nothing. Like I was dirt. The stranger's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists, but his voice stayed calm. You're not dirt, Elsie. Then what am I? He looked at her, and his eyes were clear and unwavering. You're someone who survived. That's more than most people can say. She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever looked at her like she was something other than broken. The light outside faded to dusk. The barn grew dark, and the stranger lit a small lantern, hanging it from a nail in the wall. The flame flickered softly, casting long shadows across the straw. Elsie lay down on the bedroll, curling onto her side. The stranger sat with his back against the wall, his hat pulled low, his rifle resting across his knees. He did not sleep. He just watched the door, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of its settling, the soft rhythm of Elsie's breathing. She had told him the truth, and he had not turned away. That was something. Maybe it was everything. Outside, the town slept, safe behind its painted walls and closed doors. But inside the barn, two people who did not belong anywhere sat together in the quiet, bound by a truth that no one else would believe. And in the morning, they would leave again. Because mercy, once given, could not be taken back. It started just after midnight. The stranger woke to the sound of her breathing, sharp, shallow, strained. He sat up, still half caught in the fog of sleep, and saw her doubled over on the bedroll, her hands clutching her belly, her face pale in the dim light of the dying lantern. "Elsie." She did not answer. She only gasped, her teeth clenched, her body curled tight around the pain. He was beside her in an instant, his hands hovering over her, unsure. "What do I do?" "It's coming," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The baby, it's coming." His heart kicked hard against his ribs. He looked around the barn as if an answer might be hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing. No doctor. No midwife. No woman who knew what to do. Just him. Just her. And the child forcing its way into the world, whether they were ready or not. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "All right. We'll get through this." He moved quickly, gathering what little they had. He tore a strip of cloth from his spare shirt and soaked it in water from the canteen. He stoked the small fire he had built earlier, feeding it until the flames grew bright and warm. He spread his coat on the straw beside her and helped her lie back, his hands gentle but firm. "You're strong, Elsie," he said quietly. "You've made it this far. You can do this." She nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know how." "You will," he said. "Your body knows. You just have to let it." The hours that followed were the longest of his life. The pain came in waves, crashing over her like a river in flood. She cried out, her voice raw and desperate, and he held her hand, letting her squeeze until his fingers went numb. He spoke to her in low, steady tones, telling her she was doing well, telling her to breathe, telling her it would be over soon. He did not know if any of it was true. He only knew she needed to hear it. Outside, the night was silent and still. The stars turned overhead, cold and distant. The world beyond the barn did not care what happened inside it. Life and death were small things in the Wild West. They came and went like seasons, and the earth kept turning. But in that barn, in that moment, nothing else existed. There was only Elsie, gasping and trembling, and the stranger, kneeling beside her, willing her to hold on. When the baby finally came, it came all at once. Elsie screamed, her back arching, her hands gripping the stranger's arm so hard he thought she might break bone. And then silence. A terrible, breathless silence that stretched for one heartbeat, 2, 3. The stranger's chest tightened. His hands moved on instinct, catching the tiny, slick body as it slipped into the world. The baby was small, so small. Its skin was blue-gray, its eyes closed, its limbs limp. "No," Elsie whispered, her voice hollow. "No, no, no." The stranger did not think. He wrapped the baby in the cloth and rubbed its back, firm and steady, the way he had seen a rancher do once with a newborn calf that would not breathe. He rubbed and rubbed, his jaw clenched, his breath held. And then the baby gasped. It was a small sound, wet and fragile, but it was life. The tiny chest heaved, and the baby let out a thin, trembling cry. The stranger's hands shook as he wrapped the child tighter, cradling it against his chest. The baby's skin slowly turned pink, and its cry grew stronger. Elsie sobbed, not from pain, from relief, from something deeper than words. The stranger knelt beside her and placed the baby in her arms. She held it like it was made of glass, her tears falling onto the tiny, wrinkled face. The baby quieted, its small hand curling around her finger. "It's a boy," the stranger said softly. Elsie nodded, unable to speak. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, her whole body trembling. The stranger sat back on his heels, his hands still shaking, his heart still pounding. He had delivered a life. He, who had only ever known how to take them. He stood and stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air. The sky was beginning to lighten, the stars fading into a pale gray. He leaned against the barn wall and closed his eyes, letting the chill wash over him. His hands were stained with blood. His shirt was soaked with sweat. But the baby was alive. Elsie was alive. And something in him, something he thought had died a long time ago, stirred back to life. When he returned inside, Elsie was asleep, the baby tucked against her chest. The stranger added wood to the fire and sat down nearby, watching them both. The baby's tiny fingers twitched in sleep. Its chest rose and fell, so small, so impossibly fragile. He thought about the life he had lived before this, the towns he had drifted through, the men he had shot, the debts he had paid, and the ones he had run from. He had been an outlaw once, though no one called him that to his face anymore. He had worn a badge for a while, too, working as a deputy in a town that did not care whether he lived or died. He had been a cowboy, a drifter, a hired gun. He had been a lot of things. But he had never been this. A father. The word sat strange in his mind. He was not the boy's father. He had no claim to him. No blood tied them. But in that moment, watching the child sleep in Elsie's arms, he understood something he had never understood before. Family was not about blood. It was about choice. And he had already made his. When Elsie woke, the sun was just beginning to rise. The barn was warm, filled with soft golden light. She blinked slowly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The baby stirred in her arms, and she looked down at him, her expression soft and wondering. The stranger handed her the canteen. "Drink." She did, slowly, and then looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "You did all the work." "No," she said, her voice firm despite its weakness. "You stayed. You didn't leave. That's everything." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just nodded and looked down at the baby. "What will you name him?" he asked. Elsie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Samuel, after my father." "Samuel," the stranger repeated. The name felt right. Elsie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Will you stay with us?" The question hung in the air like dust in sunlight. He could have said no. He could have walked away, the way he had walked away from everything else in his life. He could have told her he was not the kind of man who stayed, that he was better on his own, that she and the boy deserved someone better. But he did not say any of those things. Instead, he said, "Yeah, I'll stay." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. A real smile. The first one he had ever seen from her. The baby made a soft sound, and the stranger reached out, letting the tiny hand wrap around his finger. The grip was weak, but it held. And in that moment, everything he had been running from, the guilt, the ghosts, the weight of a life lived wrong, did not disappear. But it changed. Because redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about carrying it forward. It was about choosing every single day to be something more than what you had been. The sun climbed higher, filling the barn with light. The three of them sat together in the warmth, a drifter, a girl, and a newborn child. They had no home, no money, no promise of what tomorrow would bring. But they had each other. And in the wild, unforgiving West, where mercy was rare and kindness was rarer still, that was enough. It was more than enough. The stranger looked down at the boy in Elsie's arms and made a silent promise. He would protect them. He would teach the boy to be strong, to be kind, to be better than the men who had hurt his mother. He would give him a name worth carrying, a life worth living. And maybe, in doing so, he would find a life worth living too. Outside, the desert stretched on forever, vast and endless and waiting. But inside the barn, in the quiet glow of morning, 3 lives began again. Not with words, not with promises, but with a single simple choice: to stay.